Rife was a media star. He was in the newspaper all the time. The media loved him. He was working with the top researchers in the world. He was doing revolutionary work, and the media really picked this up. And then suddenly, after the 30s, nothing ever again. You never heard from Rife again. I mean, why is that? What happened?
We have a photograph which shows a banquet thrown in Rife's honor to celebrate the end of all disease. It was even announced in the media. And then, years later, all these people that were at this banquet in honor of Rife denied even knowing him.
They definitely could take a leaf out of Roy Rife's book and do an awful lot of good to this world for sickness and disease. It's a funny thing. People don't think much of you in your own country. If one of these machines was to be reworked and thoroughly analyzed by the abilities that he possessed at that time, we could start the proposition going again, which would again demonstrate that you could cure cancer. And all crazy notions of usurping rights of the American Medical Association to the contrary notwithstanding.
As far back as 1920, I conceived the idea and the possibility of when the causative agent of malignancy, so-called cancer, would be discovered and found and proven, that it would be caused by a microorganism. Of course, reception that I received that far back from the medical profession and scientists was nil. But I kept at the work, and I succeeded in eventually isolating a virus.
By all accounts, those who knew Royal Raymond Rife considered him to be a scientific genius. His greatest accomplishment was the discovery and development of a cure for cancer and for most infectious diseases during a span of 18 years' work in San Diego in the 1920s and 30s. Rife invented a series of super microscopes which allowed him to see live microbes as small as a virus, an ability considered impossible even today. Using these highly advanced optical instruments, Royal Rife was able to determine by direct observation the presence of a microorganism in cancer tumors. He named it the BX virus. Rife then went on to create another unique innovation, one that worked in conjunction with his brilliant microscopes, the Rife beam ray instrument, a device that could destroy any viral or bacterial microorganism with electrical pulses tuned to a specific frequency, an unprecedented way of fighting the infectious agents of disease without drugs. Given the monopolistic nature of the developing medical establishment in America at that time, the presentation of this drugless technique for treating a multitude of diseases ensured the demise of Rife's work. Over 70 years later, people are still trying to piece together what happened and attempt to recreate Royal Raymond Rife's lost technology. The annual International Rife Conference.
The conference is excellent. I mean, we have people here from Japan, New Zealand, obviously Canada, England, South Africa. It's growing, and there are things being done. From my understanding, there's a bill before Congress, United States Congress, that would allow, if passed, would allow licensed practitioners to use this technology as they saw fit. And I hope we're moving that way.
Originally, I read the Cancer Cure That Worked by Barry Lyons, and because of my medical background, I had the opportunity to go through all the research that was bibliographed from the 1930s and 1940s. And it's all there. It's incredible. It's all there. It's plain as day, and nobody knows about it. It's hidden. It's buried. Let's bring it out to the open.
One of the speakers at the conference, the Canadian researcher Jason Ringus, has been researching the Rife story for years.
Well, when we first learned of the Rife story, we quickly found that there was no consensus in some of the details of the story. Every time you hear this story, it's different. So what we wanted to do is acquire as much accurate information as we could possibly get. And over the years, we've accumulated letters, photographs, lab notes, newspaper articles, and we've tried to the best of our ability to bring some sort of order and consensus out of all this information.
In 1944, the Franklin Institute and the Smithsonian both published in their prestigious scientific journals a story of emerging technology in the field of optics. The article, entitled "The New Microscopes," presented several instruments that promised to significantly advance the field of microbiology. Introduced in this article was the now famous electron microscope with its extreme magnifying capabilities. Also, the Rife Universal Microscope was given a detailed and a thorough accounting. Included in this article were 3 photomicrographs taken through Rife's revolutionary optical instrument. Nothing from that period could match the resolution apparent in these photomicrographs. And these pictures were taken 10 years previous to their publication in 1944.
So when I saw this picture in the Smithsonian Institute report, why I realized that this was a microscope that I would like to have.
In our searching through some of the documents that we recovered on the Rife story, we came across the name of Professor John Hubbard. Now, in 1945, Professor Hubbard was just a medical student, and he read the article in the Journal of the Smithsonian Institute about the Rife microscope and was so impressed that he wanted to find out more. So in 1949, he wrote to Rife and to all the microscope companies asking for more information on this microscope. Now, he didn't find anything, but later in the 1970s, when he was a professor, he read another article that reawakened the Rife story by Christopher Bird, and he picked up the chase again and accumulated a number of documents that he shared with us.
Recognizing Rife's photographs as extraordinary, Dr. Hubbard sought another expert opinion.
So I went over to Don Parsons one day, and I showed him a copy of these pictures. And I asked him his opinion about them. And immediately, well, these are electron micrographs, so what? I told him no, they'd been made with light microscope back. And he immediately, this is fraudulent. That was his immediate reaction. I pointed out that these had been made long before, before electron microscopes had come on the scene. And pardon the glasses just a minute, but I would like to hold up. You all might be interested in the most recent issue of Advances in Imaging and Electron Physics, volume 115. And if you'll go back to the page 287, you will get a short synopsis of the early history of the electron microscopes. And you can see what the status of electron microscopy was at that time. Fellas, there wasn't a chance, not even if you'd wanted to be a plagiarist, you couldn't possibly have done with an electron microscope the pictures that are in that report. No possibility.
people like Rife who come up with technologies, inventions that truly do change society, they ran up against a scientific paradigm shift, that you have to bring the scientific community through this shift. And if the scientific community allows that to happen, a lot of people lose their jobs. Top people lose their positions at universities because their field becomes irrelevant overnight. And science has the hardest time allowing this to happen. It usually takes 50, 100 years for these kinds of paradigms to happen. And I think that's what's happening with Rife. It will come out, but it'll take 50, 100 years before the scientific community, the vested interests, the money, allow it or are forced to bring it to the surface.
Well, Rife's lab was one of the most advanced labs in the world at that time. He was equipped to design, build, and operate virtually any type of scientific instrument that he needed. He was able to perform experiments that few other people could do because they lacked the facilities.
All of the things that Dr. Rife had talked about 20 years ago are now coming true. This man is a genius. Oh, yes. He is absolutely a genius. No question about it. His touch for things. Did you ever see a machinist or a mechanic that was more perfect than he is? I never have. And you know who recognized it? One of the greatest men in this country, Mr. Timken.
In 1913, Henry Timken was president of one of the most prosperous industries in America, the Timken Roller Bearing Company. His factory, in Canton, Ohio, produced the tens of millions of ball bearings that kept the wheels of the mechanized industrial age turning. As the story goes, Rife developed a device for Timken's factory that saved millions of dollars a year in production costs, a scanning machine for establishing the quality of the steel used in manufacturing the ball bearings. This X-ray scanner detected flaws in the steel supply before it was sent to the production line, and in doing so, significantly increased the efficiency and output of the factory. Timken was so impressed with Rife and so grateful for his brilliant innovation that he rewarded Rife with his full sponsorship. Rife took up residence on the Timken estate in San Diego, and there, in a room above the garage, he was lavishly supplied with whatever equipment or money he needed to outfit an entire laboratory. Henry Timken's sister, Amelia Bridges, shared his regard for Rife, and before long, she too became his patron.
We've heard reports that Amelia Bridges would visit the lab, ask him if he needed anything, and just simply write out a check. So whatever he wanted, whether it was a new X-ray machine or machine tools for constructing instruments, they built a custom lab which was specifically designed for the type of experiments that he wanted to do. So he was in a unique position to accomplish some of these revolutionary things.
Rife was a master tool maker, and he knew a tremendous amount about optics. And he was also visionary in his approach. He thought outside the box. He drew outside the lines. And that's why he created something that no one has duplicated since then. I mean, when you talk with people who are supposedly the experts on microscopy, they'd say, oh, that's impossible. You know, of course, the world was flat at one time, too. You know, and the Earth had everything, all the planets revolving around it at one time too, and then everything changed. All of a sudden everything was revolving around the sun, and the Earth was round.
Why leave the conventional microscope that we have in our hands at the present time in our laboratories handicap us to the point where it is at the present time? That's why I designed and built these other instruments, because I was stopped. I was against the stone wall. I couldn't do any more.
Well, Rife had to build his microscopes out of necessity, really, because using the conventional instruments, he was unable to see the microorganisms that he knew existed from other experiments. So, in addition, in order to determine if you're destroying a microorganism, you have to be able to view it in its live state. So that's really why he began and finally built his special microscopes, which were able to view the minutest organisms in the live state.
When it comes to lenses, there isn't anyone in this country or in the world that I have ever met who can handle lens systems as well as this man can. It's just second nature to him.
A key point is the Smithsonian article published in 1944. Here the electron microscope was announced along with a Rife microscope. Now both of them could see viruses for the first time, but the difference was that Rife could see it as a movie and the electron microscope saw it as a photograph. Now if you're trying to understand an organism, it's helpful to see a photograph of something, but it's much more helpful to see it as a movie because things change over time.
Over a course of 20 years, Rife constructed a series of 5 microscopes, all of which were referred to as virus microscopes because of their ability to view these minute organisms in a live state. But how did these instruments achieve what the laws of optics define as impossible?
You cannot stain those particles with your acid and aniline dye stain. No. Simply as I've stated 1,000 times, that the particles are smaller than the molecular portions or the granular structure of your acid and aniline dye stain, so the mouse can't swallow the elephant. Naturally. They can only be stained with a frequency of light. You use a monochromatic light because the monochromatic light is a portion of the spectrum.
So when you get light in the same range or a corresponding range, it will cause those microorganisms to fluoresce. That's something that people hadn't really done before or since. Use monochromatic light to investigate microorganisms and determine species specificity, a specific species of a microorganism. One of the other working principles about it was that the way that it channels the light never allows the beams of light to cross over themselves and create diffusion of the light. So you continue to have your resolution no matter how far you take the light path. You're not losing resolution.
Well, the key features of the Rife virus microscope is that they had superior magnification with corresponding resolution. And also another important factor was the contrast that with his special illumination system, he was able to produce contrast in the organisms without chemical stains. And even when identifying the organisms, because of the way they're illuminating and the contrast that's produced with the so-called monochromatic light, you could identify which virus you're looking at by the color that it refracted. So that had never been done and probably still hasn't been done today. And so these key features of the microscope, which were far superior to what was available at the time, allowed him to discover things that other people were unable to because they simply lacked the equipment.
Yes, John, we have taken those pinpoint cells, or what's known as the needlepoint cells of pathology, and we have separated those down 14 times, and bringing the instrument clear up to 50,000 times magnification, we have photographs of those that will show that the tiny cell is composed of a series of little cells. And the little cells, again, on a higher magnification, so we bring it to 5,000 times. At 10,000 times, we see that the cells within the cells are composed of a series of little cells. Then we bring it on up and we separate it down, and we keep that little point going up, as I say, to 60,000 times, and we wonder where infinity is.
The universal microscope was a revolutionary breakthrough in optics altogether. And it's a very simple principle. what allows it to actually work. And it's amazing that no one has discovered it before then or reinvented it since then, because it isn't really outside the reach of technology that we have at all. It's fairly simple technology. It's just that the funding hasn't been there at the same time that the expertise has been there to do the work. Everything vibrates at its own frequency. If you have a crystalline protein structure involved, and you always do in microorganisms, you can set up harmonic resonance by bombarding it with frequencies as long as you're within the right ranges of frequencies. And that will literally shatter the crystalline protein structure.
It's coordinated resonance. The same as I say, you take two tuning forks that's pitched at a C or an A absolute, you strike one, the other one resonates. So we're showing an electronic frequency through the tissues of the body that simply devitalizes the bacteria with no harm to normal tissue.
Rife found lethal frequencies for at least 24 microorganisms. I say 24 because we have copies of his lab notes with those 24 microorganisms. He reportedly found frequencies for many more. For instance, we have tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, streptococcal bacteria, staphylococcal, typhoid. All sorts of microorganisms can be destroyed with the correct frequency.
We simply hunt and try. That was all we could do. We put a pure culture of the organism under the microscope, and I started and I tuned this thing.
Until you can destroy that
Until I find a frequency that will destroy it. All right, then I come back with another culture. I do it. If I can do it 10 consecutive times after the instrument has been zeroed and put it back, then I can record that.
As an inventor myself, I mean, I hold 3 patents, I build robotic systems. I understand the complexity of bringing new technology to market, but I also understand the market value of this kind of invention. And the fact that the vested interests of pharmaceutical companies would be very, very threatened if such a technology came out. And science has always had a problem with this. They've always had this problem that true breakthroughs will destroy the entire financial structure which exists. So it's just not going to happen. I mean, the funding will disappear, the government will clamp down. This happens over and over and over again.
You know, there's some of these people that you talk to them, and the more you talk to them, the more you try to explain anything to them, the more they get riled up, And Dr. Johnson, why we went through a lot of that stuff, and we checked this thing out completely from one end to the other, and we classified a frequency for an individual bacteria as its individual mortal oscillatory rate. Because when I check on that thing and look through that microscope hour after hour, day after day, tuning that damn thing to find something that's going to kill that bug, and every hour, half an hour, whatever's required, I put a new fresh culture under the microscope and keep that on, and I find something that folds it up. All right. Then I go back and zero the damn thing, come back up to my settings and put another fresh culture in it. If it'll do it 10 or 12 consecutive times, then that is recorded.
And using a simple electromagnetic wave is probably not sufficient. Dr. Rife found that using a wave that is emitted by a gas within a glass tube that has been excited by radio frequency energy, that particular wave that's emanated from that tube is a wave that is acceptable to the tissues of the body. for whatever reason, and it will penetrate deep within the body, and it can be used to selectively oscillate those particular things that the doctor, or Dr. Rife in this case, chose to oscillate, and leave everything else alone in the body. And that's the wonder of it all, is that you have this selective scalpel-like effect using resonance. It's specific, it leaves everything else alone. It's really quite an amazing, wondrous feat.
The people that worked with Rife weren't amateurs. I mean, Dr. Rosenau was called one of the greatest bacteriologists in the history of the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Kendall was referred to as America's Pasteur. Now, some people might consider that an insult, but nonetheless, that's the highest honor that one could be accorded. Dr. Milbank Johnson was head of the local medical society in California. Some of the physicists, I think Coolidge assisted him. We've had reports that C.P. Steinmetz assisted him with some of the work. Even Lee DeForest, who is credited with inventing the vacuum tube triode, was reportedly involved with Rife. So these people knew what they were doing, and I think if they weren't really impressed with what Rife was doing, I don't think they would have stayed with him as long as they did.
For what I've been able to determine, Kendall, Rosenau, Johnson, and other people like this were all top of their field. They were well respected within their field of medicine here in the United States. Dr. Kendall, he was certainly a tremendous bacteriologist, as was Dr. Rosenau. All these people were well published, highly respected. Rosenau was head of his department in the Mayo Clinic, for goodness sakes. This is not a minor position to be appointed to. Dr. Johnson was well respected at the University of Southern California, and he certainly was an individual well respected within his own medical community where he worked. He was able to, just by asking people through his influence and their respect for him as an individual and credibility, get other medical doctors involved in this work. I think that says a lot.
On the weekend following the calamitous stock market crash of 1929, Rife emerged into the public eye. The fruits of nearly 20 years of mind-boggling work were presented for the first time in this front-page headline story. Before this time, Rife had worked in private, occasionally seeking consultation with the leading minds in optics and electronics in a drive to perfect his instruments and his laboratory techniques. After the existence of his supermicroscope became widely known, the tables turned, and the experts began seeking consultation with Rife. Some of America's top bacteriologists beat a pathway directly to Rife's lab. There was a major debate raging in microbiology at the time, and it was believed that a microscope like Rife's might just settle it. The debate hinged upon the question of the existence and controversial nature of a certain kind of microorganism, referred to as a filterable form of bacteria, so called because it was so small and plastic that it could pass through the minute pores of a stone filter, too small to be seen with any conventional microscope. These very fine porcelain filters, available in different grades of porosity, are generally used in microbiology to isolate virus-sized microbes. The controversy arose when a number of bacteriologists claimed that they could take a fluid from a growth culture of a large bacteria, and after passing that fluid through a filter and placing the emerging liquid on a culture media, or food, they could cultivate or regrow the original bacteria again. Conventional microbiologists considered this result to be due to leaky filters or contaminated samples, and regarded the notion of a filterable form of bacteria as absurd. However, the findings of some filtrationist microbiologists were much more upsetting than the proposed caterpillar to butterfly type transition between some types of bacteria and their much smaller filterable forms. Some filtrationists had discovered that by changing the food or culture media, they could encourage transitions from one filterable form into many different types of organisms, all of them a different species than the bacteria that originally produced the filterable form. If this were true, it would shake the foundations of microbiology and force a complete rewrite of our textbooks. The man who pioneered this obscure branch of microbiology, known as pleomorphism, was the French pathologist Antoine Beuschon. In his time, Beuschon was an authoritative presence, renowned for his exacting laboratory methods, his precise thinking, and his vast knowledge in microbiology. He was one of France's greatest scientists. His contributions included discovering a method of dramatically reducing the cost of producing aniline dye, thereby revolutionizing the entire French garment industry. He discovered the causes of fermentation in 1855. And in 1862, he found the causes of certain rampant diseases of grapes, which were then ravaging the French wine industry. In 1865, he saved the garment industry again by finding the cause of an epidemic disease that was destroying the silkworm population of Europe. Yet, astonishingly, Beuschon was not credited with his successes. Most of his work, in fact, was plagiarized by a rival French scientist, one Louis Pasteur. It was Louis Pasteur who received recognition for determining that fermentation was caused by a microorganism, and that the silkworm disease was due to a parasite, and that grapes were being consumed by a bacteria. In her book, Beuschon or Pasteur, historian Ethel Hume demonstrates that these discoveries were absolutely attributed to the wrong man. Beuschon and Pasteur were rivals, both of them associates at France's academies of science. Even a cursory examination of their discourses and their very public arguments will readily reveal who was the gifted scientist and who was the impostor. Ironically, history has dubbed Louis Pasteur as the founder of the germ theory of disease, the idea that infection is the primary pathway to illness, a paradigm that rose and endured more out of political considerations than through an unbiased scientific inquiry. Beuschon was investigating a proposition that was much more complex than a simple infection model. In essence, Beuschon believed that the emerging germ theory of disease was incomplete. Beuchon's exacting techniques in the laboratory had revealed what he believed to be an elementary living particle. He called it the microzyma, an extremely tiny living organism capable of transforming into many different pathogenic forms as a result of changes in the chemical makeup of its host environment. With Beuchon's discovery of this tendency for his so-called microzyma to change forms, the study of pleomorphism was founded. Whereas Pasteur is remembered for his germ theory of disease, which is arguably not even his original theory, Beuchon and his theory of pleomorphism has been generally forgotten. But not by everyone, not by a growing number of microbiologists who have taken the time to experiment with new culture mediums, advanced microscopes, and living specimens. Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall was a filtrationist. He believed he had found the very media that would allow bacteria to transform into their tiny, filterable state. He called it the K media.
And this is where one of Rife's collaborators was very well known back in those times. The Kendall media, the K media. I don't know what all was in it, but the contents, the specific contents of media would influence what the growth patterns would be, or the lack of growth.
Dr. Kendall was in need of a special microscope himself for the work that he was doing, so he contacted an associate in California, Dr. Milbank Johnson, and asked him if such a microscope actually existed. So upon inquiry, Dr. Johnson found out that in fact the microscope did exist, and Dr. Kendall immediately made arrangements to visit Dr. Rife and to collaborate with him.
Rife was having his own difficulties. Despite enormous progress in his instrument refinements, he was having no success finding his proposed cancer microbe.
First, I began sectioning tissues of every known type of malignancy. I sectioned over 20,000 of those, cut them down with a special microtome to very thin. Some of them were only a micron in thickness. I studied those under the microscope, and I eventually built my first high-powered microscope for the purpose of analyzing and checking those sections. The only result that I obtained over all those years was I succeeded in developing a very excellent technique of tissue preparation, but I never found an organism that I could say was the causative agent of malignancy.
So because Rife was unable to culture any of those so-called filterable organisms on his own, it was extremely fortuitous that he met Dr. Kendall, and Dr. Kendall brought his medium to Rife, and Rife brought his special microscope to Kendall. So this unique collaboration allowed them to do things that they couldn't do individually.
That instrument we used up until 1931. With that instrument, Arthur Kendall and I, working jointly in the Pasadena General Hospital, succeeded in isolating what we classify the first filterable form of bacteria ever seen. It was isolated from the Bacillus typhosus from cultures that Dr. Kendall brought from his laboratory in Northwestern University in Chicago. And we succeeded definitely in isolating a filterable form of that bacteria using a Kendall media. It's known as Kendall media. Now that is what Kendall used for the isolation or bringing out this Bacillus typhosus in the filterable state, which is published in the Californian Western Medicine in 1931, our joint report on that. We find that the Bacillus typhosus in its filterable state is a beautiful turquoise blue body. We see them swimming through the field. They're highly motile. The transformation, as you term it, or what we term the transitional state of these organisms, is accomplished by the media upon which we grow them. That's all. Because we can change these organisms readily by the media upon which we grow them, from one organism to another, as long as that organism belongs in the same category, or what we term the same group, as a series of organisms. What I believe is that some of these non-pathogenic organisms we have with us at all time, our metabolism changes those. The same as I say, I can take a colon bacillus. In 36 hours, I can make it into a typhoid bacillus by altering the media 2 parts per million per volume. Right now, with every damn known reaction of the typhoid bacillus clear down to the wheat-all reaction. Everything. The whole thing straight through. It sure doesn't sound like what I learned in biology.
By the end of 1931, Rife and Kendall had demonstrated that a filterable organism could be cultured out of the typhoid bacillus using K media as a nutrient, and that this and other filterable organisms could be seen glowing in their own natural color through a Rife microscope. Their findings were widely publicized, and it would have been difficult for any attentive bacteriologist to have missed the exciting news of this fundamental discovery in the field or its implications. The man who introduced Kendall and Rife, Dr. Milbank Johnson, understood the politics of science and medicine. He was well aware that Rife and Kendall's findings would not, in the end, be accepted by the mere weight of science journal articles. In 1931, there was only one Rife virus microscope in full operation, and that microscope stayed with Rife. Also, not only was K-media tricky to make, its use required considerable skill and patience. Johnson felt a demonstration was necessary. He held a dinner at his Pasadena mansion to honor Kendall and Rife and give the cream of America's medical scientists a first-hand look at their achievements. This well-attended occasion was announced as a dinner to celebrate the end of all disease. Following these developments came a simple blood test that could be used to diagnose patients with typhoid fever weeks before any symptoms arose. And Rife found the frequency that would destroy this microbe, or devitalize it, as Rife would explain. But it was not enough. Finally, the voice of conventional microbiology, the most powerful man in the field, Dr. Thomas Rivers of the Rockefeller Institute, spoke out against Kendall's findings. At a medical symposium in 1932 at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Rivers and his associate Hans Zinser of Harvard publicly challenged Kendall's filtration experiments, stating that they could not repeat them, and therefore the findings of Kendall were invalid. Not once in their discourse did Rivers or Zinser express any scientific curiosity toward this new microscope, a microscope that was introduced in the same papers that announced the isolation of the filterable forms. It was as if the scientific community didn't want to know about it, and this symposium marked the advent of official denial, to which the rank-and-file scientists of the day dutifully fell behind. But there were other microbiologists who were not swayed by Rivers' authority or the threat of his censure. Dr. Edward Rosenau, chief bacteriologist at the renowned Mayo Clinic, was a man who had become a pleomorphist as a result of his findings. Rosenau had discovered a pleomorphic relationship between the Streptococcus bacillus and the much smaller poliovirus. He sought out Rife and his microscope to help him confirm this relationship.
We isolated and worked on all of these different forms down through the line. I worked with Rosenau. He worked with me. I worked with him, whatever you call it, 14 years on poliomyelitis. He was the head of the Department of Research Bacteriology of Mayo's in Rochester, and he says they want me to scrap the work. I said, hold everything. I said, I'm coming back. We went through it. And he was a great theorist on Streptococcus. And of course, he worked almost entirely on antitoxins and vaccines. We produced all the symptoms of the disease in the lymphatic chain of the albino rabbit. I found the organism. He has an article that's published in a Mayo in July 13th in 1932. It's right in there. You can see it. Rosenau wrote it. We went through. We ran this thing through. We showed them the motion pictures of the whole entire process. What did they do? They fired Rosenau. We was getting too close. You know, it's a terrible thing to talk like that, but I'm not bitter, but I'm sick of that curly stuff.
Now, I'll tell you this right now, and I may get shot later for saying it, but most microscopists, most people using microscopes in the United States, I'm not saying about Canada, Australia, any other country, but here in the United States, most of the microscopy that pathologists do, they are doing it at the very lowest level of technical skill that you can imagine. Although I will have to admit, things have improved a little bit in the last 10 or 15 years. But 40 years ago, most of the microscopy was very poor. It was just good enough that you could make a confident diagnosis. You could send that in, get it entered in the records, and you could send a bill out for it.
The lines are blurrier today than they were even at that time regarding microorganism developments. Because of new equipment, there's more that's seen than before. But what's happening is that all this emerging information is creating a revolution in the field. And now people are dealing with things that they didn't even know existed even 10 years ago. Mycoplasmas, nanobacteria, bacteria that are smaller than viruses. Right? People don't even know how to classify what they're looking at. It is such a chaotic soup. And there isn't a lot of money that goes into research around it. It's a highly undefined field. We're having to actually, there's been a language that's had to be invented even to talk about some of these things, to even name them.
Here's one thing you'll find, and you'll find it in years and years of experience, John, that it's an absolute true statement that I've found out over all the years I've worked with this work, and I've worked hard and sincerely and honestly. You'll find, by God, that 9/10 of the criticism is a cloak of ignorance. When they don't know themselves, then it ain't, as the boy says.
The concept of a virus, as we understand it today, originated with Dr. Thomas Rivers, who, in 1926, authoritatively stated that a virus can only grow within the pre-existing metabolism of a host cell. It has become a major plank of virology that a virus will not propagate upon an artificial culture media. It must be placed on a live tissue media or a host organism in order to develop. But before virology became a science, the term virus was used to denote any pathogenic microorganism that was one order smaller than a bacteria, too small to be seen. Microorganisms were viruses, from the Latin term meaning poison. Rife used the term in its archaic sense because his understanding of microbiology widely differed from what was emerging in the field. To Rife, viruses were the minute, filterable forms of the much larger bacteria, the two organisms married in a pleomorphic relationship. To conventional microbiologists, viruses and bacteria are not related, except in the sense that one needs the other to exist, in the manner that Rivers denoted in 1926. Most of them disregarded pleomorphism as fallacy, recalling the primacy of Pasteur's germ theory of disease and the spectacle of Thomas Rivers publicly shutting down Dr. Kendall in the early 1930s. Today, microbiology dictates that it would be impossible to cultivate a cancer virus out of an artificial culture media. But that is exactly what Royal Raymond Rife claimed to do in 1932, the present-day definition of a virus notwithstanding.
But I kept at the work, and I succeeded in eventually isolating a virus. We put this that you see here, this so-called PX, as I term it, the prisms are set at a certain degree of refraction for light, and we see a purplish-red organism that is highly mobile.
In order to prove the causation of disease by a microorganism, microbiologists use a set of standards known as Koch's postulates. And basically what these say is that an organism should be isolated from a diseased patient, cultured in pure culture, infecting an animal model, and then recovering that same organism while producing that same disease in the animal. And this is what Rife did. He took a human breast tumor, he cultured it with the special K medium and the culturing technique that he had developed, and then proceeded to inject it into lab rats, and then produced massive tumors in these rats, and then recovered the same microorganism from those rats. So he was probably the first and maybe only person to fulfill Koch's postulates for a cancer-causing microorganism.
transformation, as you term it, or what we term the transitional state of these organisms, is accomplished by the media upon which we grow them. That's all.
All right. We take this BX we have, isolated directly from an unulcerated breast mass. We alter the media. We no longer have what we call a BX, we have what we call a BY. This will no longer pass the W filter. We use a much coarser porosity known as the N filter. All right. Now we alter the media again, and we find a monococcoid organism. This organism can be seen readily with the good research microscope, with a proper staining and method, and we find it only in the monocytes of the blood. Now, we alter the media once again. We come from our fluid medias into a hard base of media. We use either asparagus or tomato with our auger. We no longer have here a BX. We no longer have a BY. We no longer have a monococcoid organism that we find in the monocytes of the white cells of the blood, but we have a Cryptomyces pleomorphia fungi with all its 14 stages, clear from the original hyphae up through the spores and the ascospores, on down the line. Any one of these can be thrown back in 24 hours into a BX by putting it back on K media and produce the disease.
Knowledge of this fungal transitional state came to Rife through independent research being conducted by another bacteriologist, Dr. Cameron Gruner of Canada. His microbiological research tended toward pleomorphism, and with this approach, Gruner was beginning to crack the cancer puzzle. It was all a matter of the medium. Gruner's media was based upon an asparagus agar which grew a fungus from cancerous blood. Kendall's media, which Rife used, was a protein broth which grew a virus out of cancerous tissue. When Rife and Gruner collaborated in the 1930s with the tools of Rife's laboratory to aid them, they discovered the following remarkable facts. When a sample of Gruner's fungus was cultured on K media, the so-called BX virus emerged. They could, in effect, by changing the media, turn a fungus originally grown out of cancerous blood into the virus-sized BX organism, itself grown out of cancerous tissue. To further confirm the connection, they tried culturing Rife's BX in Gruner's asparagus agar. The result, BX changed into Gruner's fungus. These experiments were repeated hundreds of times and in the end left no doubt in the mind of Rife or Gruner. There is a microorganism associated with cancer, and it is, by nature, pleomorphic.
So he conceived of the idea of putting the organisms into an oscillating electromagnetic field and causing them to oscillate, similar to the way a glass oscillates when it's hit with an appropriate audio tone. So he was looking for an electrical frequency that would cause the microorganism to shatter or to be devitalized in some sense. So what he first did was he tried the various wavelengths such as light, ultraviolet, infrared. He tried them all, and finally he came upon a range of frequencies which is in the radio range that cause the destruction of these microorganisms, and the frequencies are specific to each species.
We simply hunt and try. That was all we could do. We put a pure culture of the organism under the microscope, and I started and I tune this thing till I find a frequency that will destroy it.
By the end of 1932, Rife had isolated a virus from cancer. He had developed a unique culturing technique to sustain it and to make it visible. He had fully explored its various physical properties and had discovered additional transitional forms of the microbe. He had transplanted it into laboratory animals, producing the disease conditions resulting in tumor growth. And then he had found the mortal oscillatory rate of the virus and destroyed it with his beam ray instrument under the microscope. But one test remained. Could the beam tube kill the microorganism inside the body of a host? Rife had established annihilation of the virus in vitro, but could it be done in vivo? And further, if it killed the organism, would it cure the disease? Pleomorphists, like Rife, believe that the relationship between a germ and a disease is more complex than a simple cause and effect arrangement. As we have seen, the arrival of a microorganism in a body does not necessarily always come from an external source, but may instead be, as some claim, the result of a pleomorphic transition from another form of the germ that is already inside the body. Would this complicate the notion of killing the germ and thus curing the disease?
I guess with allopathic medicine, though, in the germ theory, the basis says that we are attacked by external microbes, viruses, bacteria, and anything in between, and that's what's infecting our body. But a pleomorphist would say that if the environment is right in our body, yeah, that can happen, but at the same time, any existing microbes we have in our body can have evolved to a higher pathological form and create disease. Okay, so as we pollute our bodies more and more with physical toxins, emotional toxins, etc., yeah, it lays the foundation for disease to develop, where one microbe can be a virus, a bacteria, or a fungal form, depending on its environment.
That itself is a very controversial notion.
Of course, yeah, it threatens the whole foundation of medicine, which is the germ theory.
Do you have any theory at all as far as malignancies are concerned in relation to oxygenation of the individual cell, or you just kill them off with frequency?
Well, we devitalize them by this frequency in the work we've done thus far with this thing. But now, here is the thing. The effect of a disease on an individual depends greatly upon the balance of the metabolism of that individual from a neutral pH. Because I sincerely believe if the body is in an absolute normal pH, it's susceptible to no disease. Because in our test tube showed that it won't anything grow on a neutral pH medium, regardless of what kind of a medium, whether it may be, whatever it is.
So what it means is you have to have a pre-existing condition in the terrain for the microorganism to take root or take hold. And then the microorganism will adjust the terrain again to make it its own environment more permanently. They do this by producing their own species-specific acids. They convert acids that come into the system into, for instance, mucorracemiosis would convert it to lactic acid, and Aspergillus niger would convert it to citric acid. But these are the acids that they use in their environment. They're their nutritive medium. And they create them themselves.
From your experience, would you consider a machine like this satisfactory for treating a patient who was considered too far advanced for surgery?
Yeah. Because our 16 cases we had at La Jolla, you can imagine what they gave us, you know. They come in ambulances. You can imagine what they gave us.
So with the successful animal experiments that Rife conducted, then Dr. Johnson convinced him that they should do a trial on humans. And Rife was hesitant at first, but then consented on the condition that a team of medical specialists would be involved. So With Dr. Johnson's supervision and under the auspices of the University of Southern California, they formed a special research committee, and in 1934 they took 16 terminally ill patients and within a period of 3 months successfully treated all of them.
So, as I say, the results we've had has been very encouraging. We had a clinic in 34 in La Jolla. Dr. Milbeck Johnson, a friend of mine, that was in Los Angeles. Well, he was one of the big brass of the Pacific Mutual Life Insurance Company, a multimillionaire. Incidentally, he was a medical politician, and he had the big whip. He could kind of show these boys in shape a little bit. So we had this clinic. I didn't want to go it, but he said, all right, let's go ahead. That was just shortly after Miss Ellen Scripps died out there, and he rented a whole Ellen Scripps home. We ran a clinic out there. We was there 90 days. We actually ran a clinic about, I would say 70 days. We did actual clinical work. And first I told him I wanted it done in a legitimate order. I said, I want you to surround on this committee with us a group of 6 of the biggest men you can pick in the United States. I said, you're a politician enough, you can do that. Which he did. He got Fisher of New York, he got Waylon Morrison, he got George Docks of Pasadena, and so on. And I says, I want as our pathologist, I want Alvin Ford, which is a friend of both of us, of course. Well, he says, good Lord, he says, you've looked at 1,000 tissues to Alvin's one. It don't make any difference. I says, he is the president of the American Association of Pathologists, and I says, I want his name on every one of these cases we treat. Now I says, I want you to organize a special medical research committee under a bona fide university, which we did under the University of Southern California. Dr. Johnson's wife, he carried a weight there too. Right, we did it. We run the clinic. We got through. We did all the reports, photographs before and after, this, that, and the other. At the end of the time when we had our meeting, Los Angeles Athletic Club up there, why, this board pronounced 14 of our cases clinically cured.
14 of the 16 patients were successfully treated in the first 70 days, and the remaining 2 were pronounced cured by Dr. James Couch after 3 more weeks' treatment with Rife's beam ray. Dr. Couch describes his impressions.
When I was told about this Dr. Royal Rife and how he had a machine out at the Scripps Institute, I went out to see about it and became very much interested in seeing the cases which he had. And the thing that brought me into it more quickly than anything was a man who had a cancer of the stomach. This was a man who staggered into a table just on the vast end of cancer. He was a bag of bones. And as he lay on the bed, Dr. Rife, Dr. Milbeck Johnson said, just feel that man's stomach, doctor. So I put my hand on his stomach, which was one solid, hard mass, about just what I could cover with my hand. And it was absolutely solid. And I thought, well, nothing can be done for that. However, they gave him a treatment of the Rife frequencies, and in the course of time, to my astonishment, he completely recovered.
How many times and what was the extent of each treatment, Dr. Rife? Well, we used 3 minutes on each treatment. And we found that the patients we treated twice a week, we got better results than the one we treated every day, simply because when we broke down, devitalized this virus or organism in the tissues of the body, it gives the lymphatic system a chance to absorb it and take it up and cast it off. We treated half of them every day and half of them twice a week. And the ones we treated twice a week, we got better results.
The following years saw a tireless push by Dr. Johnson as he sought to have Rife's work in cancer independently verified in other laboratories. They approached the Hooper Foundation and the International Cancer Research Foundation, 2 prestigious institutions which had the money and the clout to proceed seriously with the work. And there was an advanced laboratory in New Jersey operated by Dr. John Burnett, a man who had more than a professional association with Rife.
Well, Dr. Burnett's connection to Rife was through his wife, who was one of the Timken sisters. And so Burnett was also a well-known researcher, and his laboratory was probably, almost equal to Rife's. And he was doing research to verify Rife's work and other fields of electromedicine.
Where independent verification of the work was concerned, it was only Dr. Burnett who continued with Rife in good faith. The other research organizations, after a flurry of initial enthusiasm, wasted years of time by embroiling Rife and Johnson in an endless barrage of bureaucratic red tape. It seemed that the Hooper Foundation and the International Cancer Research Foundation were more concerned with satisfying the whims of impatient board members than following the rigors of clearly established experimental science.
Like all the experience that I had back east there with that International Cancer Research Foundation, Christ almighty, they collect money in there by the millions, John. And what have they ever spent? What have they ever spent for anything? For polio, they buy a couple of iron lungs. And for the cancer outfit, they spent, by God, less than $50,000 out of their $127 million that they've got in. Where's the rest of it? What are they doing with it? Christ almighty, John, $50,000 won't equip a spatter-ass laboratory.
Well, I guess they're using it to subsidize their own operations.
Well, Jesus Christ.
All businesses were as smart as they, or they might have similar success.
Yeah. No, but Jesus Christ, that kind of stuff, John. People pay in their good money. They pay in their good money towards a contribution that they think's going to be some benefit to humanity, and where does it ever go? It goes no place.
As a consequence, we've lost millions of people from disease that could have been healed by Rife's machine.
Yeah, we're losing 250,000 people every year on cancer right now. This is published figures,
Of course, the American Medical Association standard requires that there be at least 5 years of successful operation before it be recognized as a possible treatment for this sort of thing. So time was passing and everybody was getting impatient.
The successful cancer clinic in La Jolla demanded 2 necessary courses of action. 1, to get independent verification of the microbiology involved, a cooperation that was proving quite difficult for Dr. Johnson to engineer. The other necessary course of action was obvious: more experimental therapy on sick people with the beam ray.
So with that initial success, Dr. Johnson also ran clinics of his own where he treated a variety of diseases, including even cataracts and tuberculosis and various illnesses. And there was also a few other doctors. There was one doctor named James Koch, who ran the machines in his clinics and had astounding success. There was one doctor, Dr. Hamer, who was treating about 40 patients a day. As a matter of fact, he was so busy using the machine that he had to hire a couple of technicians to run the machines.
Dr. Rife evaluated it, 34, and proved it conclusively that it was absolutely perfected then. The process lingered, and then Milbank Johnson took it up to Pasadena and ran some more clinical tests in 36, 37, which were very successful.
Now, the original Rife machines were effective, but they were massive and unmanageable. So Rife wanted to build a new series of instruments that would not only be more modern with the advancements of in electronics, but be more compact and manageable so that they could be used in a clinical setting. So Dr. Johnson brought an electrical engineer named Philip Hoyland in, and with his help, they built the new instruments that were used by the doctors in their clinics.
He did the repair work, and in fact, I think Hoyland in those early days made up for Rife about 3 experimental instruments.
The basic principle of the device is the same as it was in its initial state. and rectifiers and chokes and grid biases and whatnot to install in there, you see. Greatly improved over the old original outfit. The old original outfit's all here. It's all down here. There's a row of it down there clear across this whole floor.
It appears that Philip Hoyland joined the ranks of the Rife Research Lab shortly after the first cancer clinic in La Jolla. As an employee of Rife's, his job was strictly that of electronics engineer with the task of modernizing the old equipment. However, soon after becoming immersed in the work, his involvement became much more personal and ambitious.
Rife was getting impatient. Here was something with remarkable possibilities for humanity's sake, and he wanted it in use to heal people. And then Hoyland, he had taken Hoyland into the thing as a partner with him, and Hoyland wanted some financial returns. So that led to the organization of Beam Rays Incorporated.
Initially, the company consisted of these four men: Ben Cullen as president and chairman, Rife as founder and head scientist, Philip Hoyland as engineer to build and maintain the ray machines, and a man Ben Cullen brought in who would operate as their business manager, a corporate promoter named C.R. Hutchinson. Hutchinson already owned several corporations, one of which was a correspondence school called United Polytechnical Institute. To speed up their own incorporation, Hutchinson proposed to retool his already existing school and rename it Beam Rays Incorporated. The others went along with the idea, not recognizing the pitfalls of such an arrangement with a man like C.R. Hutchinson at the helm.
Stuff is fairly divided amongst all of us. In spite of the fact that I had formed a corporation and had used my money to form the corporation and had spent months and months and months in Los Angeles doing it, I didn't ask any more than the rest. Each of us received 6,000 shares of stock in the original corporation. It was a closed corporation, and we were doing very well. And we were putting some money in the bank every month because we were receiving orders from farther and farther around. The renown was going further, and as it spread, we were getting orders. We weren't advertising it that young bit.
Cullen's rosy picture of a growing company on the road to success didn't last. Hutchinson began a series of questionable stock transfers aimed at creating operating capital. A long line of additions to the board of directors followed. At one point, its ranks swelled to 9 persons, some of whom had given Hutchinson money and others who were tied to him through his previously owned corporations. There was also the hard reality that the Beam Rays stock itself was practically worthless. The company owned no patent on the device that they manufactured. On its own, the Beam Ray machine was unpatentable.
That's a relatively simple device to make.
Yeah.
Or even back there, it was a relatively simple device to make. Stability, though, that's another matter.
And which was why no patent protection was possible, because even if you could invent a new frequency generator,
yes,
those already in use could do the same thing. So they had to keep the thing secret. And the only secret they had, naturally, was which were the frequencies that were useful.
The problem was, how does one sell this device together with the frequencies that it uses to kill microorganisms without divulging the frequencies themselves? Philip Hoyland came up with a solution. He decided to hide the frequencies within the circuitry of the machine so that the dial settings would not indicate the true frequencies, but an encoded numeric equivalent. And then he changed the way the machine itself generated those frequencies so that nosy engineers would be hard-pressed to determine what was intended as an output. As it turned out, it was a bad idea.
You know, as Rife pointed out in a 1929 article, when money comes in the door, science goes out the window. So it's much like what happened with the Beam Ray Corporation. You know, once the money came in, the greed and the infighting, and it just destroyed itself.
At some point in time, Philip Hoyland began making changes and modifications to the instruments that were fundamentally different than what Rife was doing, and that's when the machines began to fail to produce positive results. And that's also when the troubles in the Beam Ray Corporation began.
Now there was friction developing in the company. They wanted a saleable instrument, and Hoyland was making junk. And Hoyland was complaining that they weren't bringing in money enough selling these things, and they were complaining, we can't sell these things, so they'll stay sold. We had reason to believe, we felt, and we did believe, that this period of developing trouble was being brought on by Hoyland as part of a scheme to freeze out the others, and which must have had some cooperation from Hutchinson.
This schism in the company was made most evident when a group of British doctors expressed interest in Rife's work. Dr. Winter Gonin, personal physician to King George, heard about the whole affair through Dr. Koch, an associate of Rife's. Gonin and his associates wanted to acquire a Rife microscope and a beam ray device to take back to England for testing. The contentious question became, is the British group dealing with the Beam Ray Corporation, or is it dealing with the Rife Research Laboratory?
So we decided to come over, and we came over on the Queen Mary on the 8th of May, I think it was, 1938, when, lo and behold, we found that instead of dealing with our friend Rife, we were dealing with a Beam Ray Corporation, founded apparently by Mr. Hutchinson and Mr. Hoyland, and this was not the setup that we expected. However, Rife was exceedingly kind to us and meticulously careful in showing us all that he had, particularly in connection with the universal microscope. So much so that I decided to ask him to build me a smaller one, which I think I paid £1,000. And we also bought 2 machines, which we took back to my laboratory. But we found that they didn't work on examination. Some of the wires hadn't even been fastened correctly, and the frequencies which they gave off were totally different to the frequencies which were claimed to cure disease. There was nothing distinctive or educative about it at all.
Well, nobody was ever sure whether Hoyland deliberately sabotaged the machines that they sent to England, or whether he was just an incompetent bungler.
I have seen Dr. Gonin's correspondence on them.
Yeah.
He complained about that they weren't even hooked up, so the components weren't even wired together properly.
Yeah. Our own suspicion at the time was that it was deliberate sabotage because Hutchinson and Hoyland already were planning to take over the thing for themselves. You see, they had it figured out. If they could ease Rife out, then they would have time to steal from each other at their leisure later. But the first thing to do was to get rid of poor, unsuspecting Rife.
Philip Hoyland became disgusted with the whole deal because he was not getting what he thought was his fair share of the stock, which was fairly divided amongst all of us. Each of us received 6,000 shares of stock from the original corporation. Hoyland didn't think he was getting a satisfactory deal, and so he got the feeling like he wanted to show his oats a little bit. And like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and that gang, they try to find out somebody who's dissident and bribe them to become stooges for them. Well, the Han Realty Company, at the instigation of Fishbein, bribed Philip Hoyland to become a stooge.
As the primary editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Morris Fishbein wielded enormous influence over medical progress in America through the first half of the 20th century. Under his guidance and with his expansion of revenues from the journal, he converted the association from its well-intentioned origins as a benevolent overseer of national medical ethics into a vast money-making operation of questionable character. Fishbein set up a system of so-called kickbacks, a way of allowing rich corporations to buy favor with the prestigious medical journal through expensive advertising, biased reporting of client products, and effective negative propaganda against competitors. If an alternative approach emerged that competed with the hegemony of a sanctioned practice, then negative campaigns were orchestrated to destroy the competitor.
Morris Fishbein was a major contributor to holding people back. He was basically wanting to be somebody, you know, and he is. He became somebody. Unfortunately, he's infamous rather than famous.
They come up with all this stuff, and of course anything that the AMA doesn't publish, why, of course, unsanctioned, why, that is no good. But as far as I'm concerned, there isn't any AMA. There's an American drug syndicate who tells those boys what they can do. Those are the ones. Park Davis, Whitehall, and a bunch of them. They tell them what they can do.
Well, I can appreciate the position you're in because I know how those fellas are. When the osteopaths and chiropractors wanted to be licensed to go ahead here in San Diego, and they put up an awful fight with the medical society did.
Oh, they do. They bucket from one end to the other. So that's one reason a person has to be decidedly careful on any statement that is made or claims. Now, I have never made statements of claims of cures. That's one of the worst things you could possibly use, that one word, cure. They hate that word as the devil hates holy water. This cure proposition.
I want to give an example of the effect that Morris Fishbein has had on everyday society. If you go into thrift shops and places like that and look at the books they have in there, you'll often find very old textbooks, right, that have been authored by Morris Fishbein. I can tell you as a biological practitioner that a great deal of the information in them is just wrong. He held people to such a old-fashioned, outdated, dysfunctional paradigm in medicine that he created the death and suffering of untold numbers of people. See, and by him interfering with Rife for his personal gain, he compounded that even more.
The pattern that we've heard through other cases was that whenever there was some new development in medicine, that special interest groups such as the American Medical Association or pharmaceutical companies, they would either buy it and put it on the shelf, or they would buy it and monopolize it. Either way, they were in control.
So this Philip Hoyland really was the tool, in your opinion. He was an agent of other people who were trying to get in and make some money.
Get control of it.
Get control of the corporation that they could make.
At the request of Morris Fishbein. Yeah.
It began simply with a healed patient, one among many. Dr. Hamer had been operating a frequency machine at his office for several years, and with positive results. One of his most profound successes came from an 82-year-old man who was dying of a cancer that was eating away his jaw. 6 months of twice-a-week exposure to the Rife ray saw a complete recovery.
To be healed of something that looked like he was going to be suffering for a long time as this inroad developed. Why, he went back to Chicago and actually he couldn't keep still. And Fishbein heard about it. Fishbein called him in, and the old man was kind of reticent about telling him. Fishbein, of course, was unfair in doing so, and of course he'll have to pay his debt later to the Supreme Creator for having done so. But he wined and dined him, and finally learned where this machine was. Well, Fishbein got a hold of the Han Realty Company in Los Angeles, was president of the Harm Railway Company came down and had several meetings with us and finally broached the subject of buying into the corporation. Well, we couldn't do it. We were not going to do it.
That was the Beam Ray Corporation.
Beam Ray's Corporation. Couldn't do it. And we wouldn't do it.
Well, from the reports we've heard, Hoyland admitted to accepting a $10,000 bribe, which during the Depression and for someone that didn't have any money was quite a sum of money. And the reason that he accepted it was because he needed the money, of course, but the people that bribed him, because they were unable to buy into the corporation through conventional means, they tried to get control of the company through Hoyland.
I noticed that Philip was showing considerable appearance of friendliness toward them, and I didn't think much about it. Until later I found out that they had got hold of him and bribed him with a $10,000 check. It came from many sources and from his own lips that they paid him $10,000, and he had wished to God that he had never accepted it. But just like Judas Iscariot that betrayed Jesus, why, as soon as he got that $10,000 check, then he kicked us into the courts.
Philip Hoyland, who was reportedly supported by agents of the American Medical Association, brought a lawsuit to have the directors of the corporation replaced and perhaps that way secure his own interests.
Shortly after the Hahn brothers had given Hoyland a $10,000 gift, and just prior to the filing of his lawsuit, a famous attorney, Aaron Shapiro, arrived in San Diego, ostensibly to help Hoyland sort out the contracts they had with the British group headed by Dr. Gonin. It was only later that Rife and the others discovered who Hoyland's new lawyer really represented.
But what happened was this, that Aaron Shapiro came out from Chicago, a prosecuting attorney, paid by the AMA.
Now, how do you know that Shapiro was paid by the AMA?
Because he made that statement.
Oh, he said that himself.
He made that statement to Bert Comparet and to others, and of course I was oftentimes in the group and I heard what he was said.
The British group wanted to sever its contracts with the Rife Beam Ray Corporation, insisting that they deal only with Rife. Hoyland's apparent subterfuge had soured them considerably. To see where they stood legally, the board of directors of Beam Ray let Shapiro go through their books and allowed him to examine the minutes of all past meetings. It was then that Shapiro told them that much of the activity that had occurred in the company with regard to Hutchinson's earlier transfers of stock was illegal. With Hoyland at his side, Shapiro advised that, in order to save the company from impending litigation, they must take action against Hutchinson and completely reorder the board of directors. Seeing this as a transparent attempt by Hoyland to take control of the company, the directors declined Shapiro's advice. At that point, at the beginning of 1939, Philip Hoyland filed suit against the directors themselves on the grounds of dereliction of duty by refusing to act against C.R. Hutchinson. His lawyer in the trial would be Aaron Shapiro. The actual hearings would begin in June. Before that, there would be 5 months of depositions, affidavits, and the filing of a countersuit against Hoyland. When the pretrial motions began, the first order of business for Shapiro was to subpoena Rife. This move forced Rife to cancel his long-range plans to travel to England to spend time instructing Dr. Gonin on the use of his equipment. Gonin's group had earlier purchased several frequency machines and borrowed a microscope. Rife had sent his trusted assistant Henry Seiner to England, where he resided for a year helping Dr. Gonin recreate Rife's methods. But they had gone as far as they could without Rife's expertise for guidance, and now because of the court case, the English venture was critically delayed.
days, my primary function was to take a microscope over to England and to teach to Dr. Gonen. Now, the microscope which Dr. Gonen had bought and paid for was still here, and it was our hope that Dr. Rife could have come over and joined me in London. That was the plan. And in the meantime, I tried to get everything ready for that event. And there was one delay and another, and to make a long story short, the American Medical Association stepped in, and we had quite a battle with them.
The delay in Rife's departure was just long enough to allow for another wide-ranging event to intervene and put a final end to the English venture with Dr. Gonen.
And that's what Henry went over there for, and I was supposed to go over, but the war came and stopped me, so I didn't get over, and he just barely got back by the skin of his teeth. And so the instrument's been lying there ever since, and nobody can operate it.
In mid-May, as Seiner was preparing to leave London after his year-long stay at Gonen's laboratory, a disaster occurred back in America. Rife's research associate and good friend, Dr. John Burnett, lost his elaborate New Jersey laboratory in a devastating fire. The fire completely destroyed Dr. Burnett's lab and all of its contents, marking an end to not only his own research, but his long collaboration with Rife. Coincidentally, while the fire burned in New Jersey, the Burnetts were visiting Rife in San Diego. They were in California because Amelia Bridges had died. Amelia Bridges was Amelia Timken, sister of Dr. Burnett's wife, Cora Timken. Amelia Bridges was also Rife's main patron. Over the years, she and her brother Henry Timken had given Rife millions of dollars to build and operate his laboratories. With one final gift from Amelia's will, Rife would see his last taste of big money.
1939, the key year to the whole story. This is the year that Rife self-destructs and is destroyed. 1939, the year of the trial. He's forced to defend himself in this lawsuit, and he spends his energy and time not in the lab but preparing for the trial, financially paying lawyers. You know, this is something, the inventor's worst nightmare is having to defend yourself and then being financially destitute at the end of it, even though you win, which Rife did. You know, the trial judge even looked at it at Rife and wanted to allow him to countersue. 1939, you have World War II starting. You've got England suddenly at war. Rife has a couple of beam ray tubes over there. Suddenly transatlantic trade is curtailed, and it's very difficult to get any kind of information and materials back and forth. And also in the 1939, Amelia Bridges dies, which is something that as an inventor I can totally understand. This was his business angel, person who helping him out all the time when he's in trouble, financially, emotionally. And suddenly all three of these things coalesce together to kind of like the perfect storm to destroy Rife. And he's left destitute at the end of it and becomes an alcoholic. And as everyone knows, that's the drug that will destroy any human being.
We talked a bit about that.
I remember the information on it, and basically at the time, like I said, it was a much smaller universe. You could drag one guy with an invention in there, and you could beat him to death by pulling him to court 35 times in a row and turn him into an alcoholic.
Let me ask you about Rife's deterioration, his alcoholism.
Well, that began with this. Rife was one of those men who shouldn't have any alcohol at all at any time. Now, when this case came up, we knew, of course, that part of the testimony to be taken in the case would be Rife's statement that he had devised this method and employed Hoyland to do the work, that all Hoyland knew was what Rife had told him. It was Rife's work. So I had a talk with Rife. Now, so many people have an exaggerated fear of being on the witness stand. And Rife had that to a very high degree. Well, I assured him we would simply have to show that it was through him this knowledge came in, and that was all that Hoyland had. Well, he began drinking, and from then on, he was an alcoholic.
So he began drinking actually before the trial began?
Oh, yes. It was his worry over having to appear as a witness and be badgered and browbeaten by attorneys and so on. That's what got him started drinking.
I see.
Well, Rife was called in to testify 2 or 3 times, as you know. And Judge Kelly was a wonderful man, but Rife had never been in court. And he just became a nervous, gibbering idiot. Wow. In that he couldn't stand. He did his best to keep calm, but his hands were shaking like this. And of course he had started smoking pretty heavily. But anyway, he took to drinking because the doctor couldn't find anything to stop his nervousness without forcing him into a drug addict. He thought the next best thing was just give a little brandy and it would be all right. Finally he got so he had to crave it.
The character of Royal Rife, as might be described, he was apparently, he had a hubris which was maybe understandable, but it was ruinous. This was really the cause of his becoming an alcoholic. Having to go to trial in a court where he would not be the ringmaster was something that he couldn't take. Trials can be brutal. Some trial lawyers, you're strictly at their mercy or the mercy of the judge, and it doesn't matter what the truth is. You can still get crucified. And that trial lasted a year. So that was time enough for him to buckle.
The court hearings began on June 5, 1939. Aaron Shapiro prosecuted for the plaintiff, Philip Hoyland, and San Diego trial lawyer Bertrand Comparet defended the Beamray Corporation. Both parties had waived on a jury, and Judge Edward Kelly, who presided over the case, would make the trial's final decision. First before the court was Shapiro, who laid out Hoyland's complaint, declaring that the affairs of the company had become muddled and confused due to the questionable activities of Mr. Hutchinson, their general manager. Shapiro charged that Hutchinson had taken loans from various associates based upon the promise of the issuance of stock at some time in the future when they were licensed for such a transfer. They then charged that Hutchinson kept $500 of this money for himself. The solution, argued the prosecution, was to send the company into receivership, to forcefully replace the board of directors with a group more amenable to Hoyland's belief in how the company should be run. Comparet's answer to these charges was to argue that Hoyland knew all about these transfers of stock and money at the time they were happening. It was all up front and out in the open and recorded in the minutes of the meetings of the Beamray Corporation, meetings which Hoyland had attended and whose signature was affixed to the records in question. Further, all of the current board of directors of the company had written affidavits opposing Hoyland's action, which was supposedly on behalf of the company. And it was finally stated that, if there was any discord, strife, or illegality in the company, it was coming from the activities of Philip Hoyland and no one else. Judge Kelly, fascinated with the case, decided that a full hearing was needed to get at all the particulars of the case and ordered them to proceed.
When anybody is apparently giving the medical monopoly a tough time, why, they go after him.
You know, anyone who had one of these, a medical man, he was told to either get rid of it right now as soon as we started our case in court. in Judge Kelly's court, or else lose his membership in the AMA. And that's what forced Dr. Hamer out of it. And of course he returned his 2 machines back to us, and we had to cover him on his expenses. But that, of course, eventually took place with all of them. That's what shut us down.
The American Medical Association stepped in and began to dispute all of the work that we had done. And we had quite a battle with them. Such a terrific battle that Dr. Rife completely backed away because he is not a businessman or a fighter. He's a scientist.
Here are the conclusions of law. One, that plaintiff Philip Whiland should take nothing by his said complaint, and that the defendants and each of them should have and recover of said Philip Whiland their costs and disbursements herein incurred.
Yeah, we never got a penny.
However, Judge Kelly saw that Fishbein was trying to cause trouble when there really was no trouble there, because actually all the information that was brought out in the case was pretty well corroborated by the various doctors. Dr. Johnson, Milbank Johnson, Dr. Rosenau, Dr. Gruner, Dr. Arthur I. Kendall, and Dr. Couch.
You mentioned this fellow, Shapiro was the lawyer's name that Fishbein sent?
Aaron Shapiro was engaged by Fishbein.
And then you mentioned after the trial was over that this judge offered to fight these people?
Judge Kelly offered to fight, and actually it was kicked into a straight out-and-out deal with the American Medical Association then. He offered to defend my case against him. But I was broke. I had had so doggone much of it. I had a year and 3 days, and I was so doggone flat that I just took a few tools I had and went down the back door of Convair and got me a job in the machine shop.
Well, it's a damn shame. That's all I've said all the while. Try to man as you are, and then have him put the rope around your neck and choke you to death.
Well, I'll tell you, the few years back, why, my eyes was bad, you know, when I work over those instruments 16, 18, 20 hours a day in and day out. My eyes got so that I couldn't see anymore, and I become absolutely, as Amos and Andy says, regusted. And I quit.
Rife was always looking for help because he still had the ardent desire to see the stuff go and get into use. And although during his clear moments he had sane moments when he wasn't under the influence of liquor, he would endeavor to progress. But every dead gum day at a certain time he'd go and get one little nip out of his car. And that was the end of it. From that time on it became maudlin. Useless as tits on a board for the rest of the day.
The threats and intimidation by the AMA upon doctors using the frequency instrument were not completely successful. There was still a core of doctors close to Milbank Johnson who continued treating their patients with frequencies. Dr. Johnson was too politically powerful for coercive tactics. Apparently, Morris Fishbein was careful about whose toes he stepped on. But Dr. Johnson's influence ended in 1944, when he died in hospital during a sudden illness.
Dr. Johnson picked him up to finish up on some of these patients who wasn't quite through yet. That was very good. Dr. Johnson died. 2 weeks after Dr. Johnson died, they came to the doctor and says, he belonged to the county board and all this, that, and the other. He says, you can't use that thing anymore. We're going to throw you out of the county board if you keep on using that thing. Incidentally, we had 5 cases then of tuberculosis in the volcano home up there. And they were coming along in pretty good shape. So, the doctor said, all right. He said, don't make any difference. He says, you take my county board away from me, I don't care, but he says, I'm going to finish up on these patients, which he did.
And after that time, Dr. Milbank Johnson died, and all the rest of the doctors sort of scattered like a bunch of scared rabbits with their tails between their legs, and nothing has been actually accomplished by this great medical help that was first gathered together in the beginning.
In 1946, the year Rife is forced to close his lab. During the war, he kind of descended into alcoholism, and by the end of 1946, he had created up his lab, and it no longer was a functioning facility. Now that's a critical point, because he can't continue his experimentation. He can't show that the techniques he was working on are valid. And the world, he had done most of his key research in the 1930s. He had cured cancer. And yet, 10 years later, he's irrelevant. It must have been a huge blow for him.
And he was very despondent, became very despondent about the whole thing. And all of our research came to a halt. It was most unfortunate. That's about all I can tell you.
In 1950, an engineer by the name of John Crane came into contact with Rife through a piece of drafting equipment that he wanted to purchase from him. And in hearing Rife tell his story, he was so impressed that he decided to devote his life to furthering this work and trying to bring it to the people so that they can be benefited.
Now later, when John Crane came into the thing, Crane has a pretty good analytical mind, all right. He's stubborn as hell. Mm-hmm. He's his own worst enemy.
Yes.
But he has a good mind.
John Crane was a mechanical engineer who befriended Rife, and after becoming familiar with the various fruits of Rife's genius, began thinking of ways of exploiting them. Within a few years, Crane had developed a partnership with Rife and a new company, Life Lab. Its purpose? To develop and market Rife's inventions. And there were other people involved, most notably another engineer named John Marsh.
Now this is good and bad in many ways. Good that Rife finds a champion who believes in him, allows him to continue his work, but bad in the fact that Crane is not a scientist, he's an amateur. Bad in the fact that you haven't got a Timkins who's supplying you with a lab, $1 million lab. And he's not working with the Kendalls of the world, he's working with amateurs. And what they're doing is more just trying to commercialize Rife's previous inventions. And then it doesn't work out anywhere near as well as it could have.
In the mid-1970s, a few years after Rife's death, Dr. John Hubbard traveled to San Diego in an attempt to get a fuller picture of what happened to the Rife microscopes and possibly even track one down. He met separately with Ben Cullen, Bert Comparet, Henry Seiner, and others. But he finally found what he was looking for when he arrived at John Crane's house. What he found out before he got there was that most people who were friends of Rife's did not approve of Crane and his influence. It was John Crane who inherited all of Rife's estate, and after Rife died, Crane became very litigious about who owned Rife's inventions.
I'm sorry that I was so naive back in those early years. I didn't realize the importance of money, the desire to get money with this process. But that's the whole thing. That Crane was interested in this for the money he could get out of it.
And Rife, what was he interested in?
Rife was only interested in the science of it.
Well, Crane certainly had the zeal to continue on Rife's research and bring it forward, but he didn't really have the knowledge and understanding that really would have been required. And also, I think his interests were partially clouded by commercial interest in trying to produce this commercially rather than focusing on the science.
Seiner was a vice president and a very responsible, had very responsible positions in the business world there. And I openly was tape recording all of these interviews except the telephone interviews. I openly tape recorded them. And I noticed Signer would never, he was very quiet. And I was wondering whether he was trying to not say anything that my tape recorder would pick up that could possibly put him in legal jeopardy. He knew I was going to be seeing Crane and going out there, but Signer was very bitter in his quiet way about Crane. He blamed Crane for keeping and advancing Rife's being an alcoholic. That was the real basis for Signer's intense. He is very quiet but very intense disapproval of Crane.
Now, how did he describe Crane having done that? How did Crane,
well, apparently, for Rife to get the money to buy alcohol, he would borrow it from Crane, and Crane took equipment for security and for sale.
I asked Rife because I thought Rife would certainly say that the way Crane was working on it then was still using the Rife principle, but he indignantly denied it.
At the beginning of the 1960s, John Crane came up with the idea of taking the variable audio frequency that were operating in the original type of Rife machines, and he thought of applying that directly to the body through metal plates, and thereby completely changed the design and the principle of the Rife instrument.
John and Dr. Rife and myself have hung very close together here, working continuously in the lab to try to better some of the things that we have. And I too believe that the instrument with the tube is far more reaching and much more effective than the double probe type instrument. However, I have received and used the double probe instrument on a few of my personal friends for the sake of clinical research and have had great results from it. And I'm speaking of the one that does not have the tube.
Well, Crane originally was, with more modern technique, duplicating the Rife machine, tube and all.
Tube and all, okay.
For early experiments. And, as I say, he came to the conclusion that you just weren't getting anything additional by the use of the tube. If you didn't get the frequency, you could run the rest of it indefinitely and nothing happened.
Crane and Marsh, wishing to focus exclusively on developing their own modified devices, gave the original Rife machines to various doctors who wanted to use them clinically. One such physician was Dr. Robert Stafford of Dayton, Ohio.
The machine we used was the one John Marsh brought from California, and it was actually a machine that Mr. Rife allegedly had loaned to John Crane. And he had that machine, or a couple of them, I guess. But Marsh took one of those and brought it out here.